Hi, eighth grade. Welcome to chapter 16 of Farewell to Manzanar. So we're going to take a look at the questions that go with this chapter first. Although it's a pretty short chapter, there's several questions within it. And it's going to require quite a bit of thinking on your part as far as the answers to the questions. Some of them are going to connect to your life. And I just wanted to compliment many of you on the fantastic answers that you've been giving. Some of you are writing a really good paragraph to answer each question, and that is really what I'm looking for. These really are meant to be ACE answers. I expect you to restate and answer the question, and I'd like you to cite at least 2 text details for many of these because most of them have more than one question within the question that's there, and where you can, I expect that you're going to explain it. So quite often I'm looking to see about 5 sentences, which many of you have been doing. If you have not, please try to bring up that standard so that you can improve in your writing, your thinking, and your development of details. So let's take a look at chapter 16. Question 1. The case of Fred Korematsu raised the compelling question of why Italian Americans and German Americans were not also evacuated as a matter of national security. Why do you think the government targeted only Japanese Americans for relocation? So thinking about World War II, we were at war not only with Japan, but also Germany and Italy. So why was it that only the Japanese were targeted? Why not German Americans? Why not Italian Americans? What is the main difference within that? And some of this is going to be your own thought process. There's many possible answers that you can give me here. So do some thinking and reflecting, some inferring, and give me your thoughts as to why. Some of it is going to tie into this case and pull in, what are you thinking based on that? Question 2, the 3 landmark legal challenges to the internment camp orders were all brought by Nisi. Why do you suppose Nisi were more likely than EC to challenge the government's orders? So I want you to go back to the beginning of the book and look at what is the difference between the EC and the Nisi, and that is on Roman numeral page 15 at the beginning. Remember that the EC are the first generation here in the States. They are never allowed legalization rights. Although they immigrated and lived in the country, they are not allowed to become citizens. On the other hand, the Nisi are by birth American citizens. So what would that difference cause or allow them to make that challenge to the government here and make those legal questions. Question 3, what group of Californians might have an economic motive to promote racist hatred towards the Japanese Americans? So economic meaning because of money. How would it benefit them to allow the racism to occur? Question 5, after the war, the Wakasugi family is free to go, yet Jean's parents decide to stay at Manzanar for as long as possible. What fears keep them there? And then question 6, most of the Wakasugi family moves to New Jersey, but Papa decides to return to the West Coast with his wife and remaining children. Why? What would you have done? So that's where it comes into your connection. What would you have done? Would you have done the same thing as Papa? Would you have gone to New Jersey? What would you have done? Or something different. Question 7, the author makes a comparison between her father and some freed slaves after the Civil War. Is this an apt comparison? Explain your thoughts about this. Now remember that our author is our main character, Jean, so when we're making that comparison, this is to Papa and his decision to go to California or to remain in Manzanar. How is that similar to the things that happened with the slaves? And do you think that makes sense, that comparison that she makes? So those are the questions that you're going to keep in mind as we read the chapter today. I hope that you have your book handy with you. We are on page 125. The chapter is called Free to Go. The answers began with a Supreme Court ruling that December in the case called Ex parte Endo. It was the last of 3 key cases heard since the camps had opened. In the first, Gordon Hirabayashi, a Nisi student from the University of Washington, challenged the evacuation order. He had also violated the Army's curfew, imposed early in 1942 on all West Coast Japanese. He challenged the racial bias of these actions and the abuse of his civil rights. The court avoided the issue of the evacuation itself by ruling on the curfew. It upheld the Army's decisions to limit the movements of a racially select group of citizens. The reasoning, wartime necessity. In the second case, the issue was the exclusion orders that removed us from our homes and sent us inland. Fred Korematsu, a young Nisi living in Oakland, had ignored the evacuation to stay with his Caucasian girlfriend. He had plastic surgery done on his face. He changed his name and was posing as a Spanish Hawaiian when the FBI caught up with him. In court, the racial bias was challenged again. Why were no German Americans evacuated, it was asked, or Americans of Italian descent? Weren't these nations our enemies too? Due process had been violated, Korematsu claimed, along with other constitutional rights. But the Army's decision to evacuate was also upheld by the Supreme Court. The final case challenged the internment itself. Soon after she was evacuated in April 1942, Mitsu Endo, a 21-year-old Nisi and an employee of the California State Highway Commission, had filed a petition for habeas corpus, protesting her detention at Topaz Camp in central Utah. She spent 2.5 years awaiting the High Court's decision, which was that she had been right. The government cannot detain loyal citizens against their will. Anticipating this ruling, the Army's Western Defense Command had already announced that the mass exclusion orders of 1942 were being withdrawn. Next, it was announced that all the camps would be closed within the coming 12 months, and that internees now had the right to return to their former homes. So they have a year to decide where they're going to go. They can leave right away if they want to, but the camps won't close for a year, giving them some time to make arrangements and do what they need to. In our family, the response to this news was hardly joyful. For one thing, we had no home to return to. Worse, the very thought of going back to the West Coast filled us with dread. So we get into some of the fears. What will they think of us, those who sent us here? How will they look at us? 3 years of wartime propaganda, racist headlines, atrocity movies, hate slogans, and fright mask posters had turned the Japanese face into something despicable and grotesque. Mama and Papa knew this. They had been reading the papers. Even I knew this. Although it was not until many years later that I realized how bad things actually were. In addition to the traditionally racist organizations like the American Legion and the Native Sons of the Golden West, who had been agitated against the West Coast Japanese for decades, new groups had sprung up during the war, with the specific purpose of preventing anyone of Japanese descent from returning to the coast. Groups like No Japs Incorporated in San Diego, the Homefront Commandos in Sacramento, and the Pacific Coast Japanese Problem League in Los Angeles. Also, some growers' associations, threatened by the return of interned farmers, had been using the war as a way to foment hostile feelings in the major farming areas. So there's your group that would be looking for economic gain. I'm sorry. The farmers don't want them to come back because they're doing much better economically now that the Japanese are not there for competition. So they're promoting these things. What's more, our years of isolation at Manzanar had widened the already spacious gap between the races. And it is not hard to understand why so many preferred to stay where they were. Before the war, one of the standard charges made against the Japanese was their clannishness, their standoffishness, their refusal to assimilate, to become part of the group, to try to become more like an American. The camps had made this a reality in the extreme. After 3 years in our desert ghetto, at least we knew where we stood with our neighbors, could live more or less at ease with them. Yet now the government was saying we not only were free to go, like the move out of Interminable Island and the move to Owens Valley, we had to go. Definite dates were being fixed for the closing of the camp. By January of 45, a few determined internees were already trying to recover former homes and farmlands. Ominous reports of their reception began trickling back to confirm our deepest fears. A Nisi man had been assaulted on the street in Seattle. A home was burned in San Jose. Night riders carrying shotguns had opened fire on a farmhouse near Fresno, narrowly missing 2 sleeping children. Later on in May, one of my sisters and her husband, leaving for the east, were escorted to the Southern Pacific Depot in Los Angeles by armed guards, not because they were thought to be dangerous, but for their own protection. I'm going to pause for just a second to make a connection that we never really got to make earlier. So you hopefully saw it on the website for Anne Frank, but the concentration camps were starting to be liberated at this exact same time frame in history. So Otto Frank, the father, was at Auschwitz, and Auschwitz was liberated in January of 45. So he was free. But it took time for the Allies to get to all of the different concentration camps. And I believe that Bergen-Belsen, which is the camp that the girls were at, was not liberated until May. So it's kind of an interesting correlation with those times. However, the girls had died before their camp was liberated. I believe they died in March. Anyways, back to our current book. Most of the Japanese returning to the coast resettled without suffering bodily harm, but gossip tends to thrive on bad news, not good. Stories such as these spread through the camp and grew in our minds like tumors. I remember hearing them discussed in our barracks quietly, as if Ku Klux Klansmen lurked outside the window, the same way my brothers discussed our dilemma during the brief stay in Boyle Heights before the evacuation. I would listen to the stories and I would cringe, and this was both odd and confusing to me, because ever since we'd arrived, the outside world had loomed in my imagination as someplace inaccessible, yet wonderfully desirable. I would recall our days in Ocean Park. I would flip through the Sears Roebuck catalog, dreaming of the dresses and boots and coats that were out there somewhere at the other end of the highway beyond the gate. All the truly good things that often seemed the things we couldn't get were outside and had to be sent for or shipped in. In this sense, God and the Sears Roebuck catalog were pretty much one and the same in my young mind. Once during a novena at the Mary Knoll Chapel, I had asked for something I desperately longed for, and I had never seen inside the camp. We were told to ask for something we really wanted. We were to write it on a piece of paper, pray devoutly for 9 days, and if we prayed well, it would be answered. The nuns expected us to ask for purity of soul or a holy life. I asked God for some dried apricots. I wrote this on a piece of paper, dropped it in the prayer box, and began to fantasize about how they would arrive in a package from Sears Roebuck. I knew how they would taste and feel in my hands. I said my rosary 30 times a day for 9 days, and for 9 days more after that, I waited. The dried apricots never came. My faith in God and in the Catholic Church slipped several notches at that time, but not my faith in the outside, where all good things could be found. I went back to flipping through the catalog. Those images, of course, had come from my past. What I had to face now, a year later, was the future. I was old enough to imagine it, and also old enough to fear it. The physical violence didn't trouble me. Somehow I didn't quite believe that, or didn't want to believe such things could happen to us. It was a humiliation. That continuous unnamed ache I had been living with was precise and definable now. Call it the foretaste of being hated. I knew ahead of time that if someone looked at me with hate, I would have to allow it, to swallow it, because something in me, something about me deserved it. At 10, I saw that coming, like a judge's sentence, and I would have stayed inside the camp forever rather than step outside and face such a moment. I shared this particular paralysis with Mama and Papa, but not with my older brothers and sisters. The hostility worried them, but their desire to be rid of Manzanar outweighed that worry. They were in their 20s and had their lives to lead. They decided to take a chance on the East Coast. It was 3,000 miles away with no history of anti-Orientalism. In fact, no Oriental history at all. So few people of Asian ancestry had settled there, it was like heading for a neutral country. Bill was the first to make that move with Tommy and their baby boy. He had lined up a job with Seabrook Farms in New Jersey, a new frozen food enterprise that offered work to many Nisi at the end of the war. A few weeks later, Frances and her husband joined them, followed by Martha and Kaz, then Lillian, who had finished her junior year in high school, and Ray. As each cluster of relatives departed, we'd say, "See you in New Jersey. Find us all a big house back there." What we told each other was that Bill and Frances and the others would go on ahead, make sure things could be worked out, then they'd send for the rest of us. "See you in New Jersey," we would wave as the bus pulled out, taking someone else to the train station in LA. But they all knew, even as they said it, that Papa would never move back east. As bad as the West Coast sounded, it was still his home territory. He was too old to start over, too afraid of rejection in an unknown part of the world, too stubborn and too tired to travel that far, and finally too proud to do piecework on an assembly line. Like so many Isi, he had, for better or worse, run his own businesses, been his own man for too long to tolerate the idea of working for someone else. The truth was, at this point, Papa did not know which way to turn. In the government's eyes, a free man now, he sat like those black slaves you hear about who, when they got word of their freedom at the end of the Civil War, just did not know where else to go or what else to do, and ended up back on the plantation, rooted there out of habit or lethargy or fear. That's the end of chapter 16. One connection I'll make that not all of us read this year, but the book Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which took place in the 1930s before this happened, was in the South, and it dealt with racial issues between free African Americans and the whites that lived in that town. And many of those people were why can't I think of the word? Social studies word. I hope you can think of it. I'm blanking. So they worked the land. Sharecroppers finally came to me. So they worked the land that belonged to someone else, and they earned a little bit off of that, and they could keep what they needed to eat. Quite often, they ended up being in debt to these white farm owners. So really, were they free? Not necessarily. So the slavery took on a different form in the form of sharecropping. All right, so that wasn't really totally connected. That's the end of chapter 16. Hopefully you're able to find all of the answers that you need. Some of you have reached out that if I didn't fully answer and you struggled to figure out what the answer to that question was, please do ask. I don't mind helping you if you can't figure out. Some of them are really challenging. So if there's something that's ironic, or you're like, this one doesn't really make sense to me, please reach out, ask that question, and I will do my best to help you. All right, have a great day.